Some men don't become dangerous because they hate the world. They become dangerous because the world took everything first. The storm rolled low across the Wyoming prairie, dragging thunder behind it like chains across dry earth. Wind pushed against the lonely cabin sitting half a mile from Black Creek, rattling the wooden shutters Elias Blackwood never bothered fixing. He preferred things broken. Broken things stayed quiet. For nearly 10 years, nobody crossed that land unless they were lost, desperate, or stupid enough to ignore the stories whispered in saloons after midnight. Stories about the cowboy who buried 7 men in one night, then vanished from the world like smoke after gunfire. Elias stood beneath the porch roof sharpening a rusted horseshoe nail against a whetstone, his old Stetson dripping rainwater down the back of his faded duster coat. The lantern beside him flickered gold against the hard angles of his weathered face, catching the pale scar above his eyebrow. He heard the horse before he saw it. Fast, uneven, running scared. Elias slowly lifted his eyes toward the dark prairie stretching beyond the fence line. Through sheets of rain, a white horse burst across the field like a ghost fleeing hell itself. The rider nearly fell from the saddle before the animal even stopped moving. A woman, white dress soaked dark from rain and dirt, one sleeve stained crimson near the shoulder. She hit the ground hard enough to stumble against the fence post, breathing sharp, frightened breaths into the cold air. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. The woman looked up toward the porch light, and for one long second neither of them said a word. Her green eyes locked onto his with the kind of fear that only comes after someone's been running for a very long time. She couldn't have been older than 30. Rich Eastern fabric clung to her frame beneath the mud and rain, completely wrong for frontier country. Her chestnut hair hung loose and tangled against her pale face as thunder rolled across the valley behind her. "Please," she whispered, barely audible over the storm. "Don't let them find me." Elias stared at her without expression, but something cold shifted inside his chest when he noticed the fresh hoofprints tearing across the mud behind her horse. More riders were coming. Fast. The woman followed his eyes toward the horizon, and panic flooded her face. "They're close," she said quickly. "Pleased if they see me here, they'll kill me." Elias finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "Who?" The woman hesitated. That hesitation told him more than the answer would have. Powerful men. Dangerous men. Men people feared enough not to name aloud. Lightning flashed across the prairie, and for half a heartbeat Elias saw movement far beyond the hills. Riders. 3 of them. Maybe 4. He leaned the whetstone slowly against the porch rail. The woman noticed the change in his face immediately. "You know them?" she whispered. Elias didn't answer, because he did know them. Even from half a mile away, he recognized the lead rider's shape in the saddle. Tall, broad shoulders, gray coat. Kane Mercer, a man Elias once rode beside before Black Creek drowned itself in greed and smoke. The woman took a shaky step backward when she realized the silence between them had changed. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Elias looked at the approaching riders, then back at the terrified woman standing in the rain outside his door. For 10 years, the world had left him alone. But the second he looked into her frightened green eyes, he understood one thing with terrible certainty. By sunrise, that peace would be gone forever. Rain hammered against the cabin roof while Elias stood motionless beneath the porch light, watching the riders grow larger through the storm. Claire Whitlock followed his gaze with trembling breaths, her fingers clutching the torn fabric near her shoulder as if holding herself together by force alone. The white horse beside the fence snorted nervously, sensing danger long before human beings ever could. Elias finally stepped aside from the doorway without looking at her. "Inside," he said quietly. Claire hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed not to trust a man whose eyes looked colder than the storm itself. But the riders behind her were closer now, and fear has a way of making choices for people. She crossed the porch quickly, boots thudding against wet wood as she stepped into the dim cabin. The smell of cedar smoke, leather, and old coffee filled the air. It was warm inside, but not welcoming. Nothing about Elias Blackwood felt welcoming. A rifle rested above the fireplace. Another leaned beside the kitchen table. A third sat near the window, already loaded. Claire noticed all of them immediately. Men who expected peace did not sleep surrounded by weapons. Elias shut the door behind her and slid the iron lock into place with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than thunder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Water dripped from Claire's dress onto the wooden floorboards while Elias removed his hat slowly, revealing dark hair streaked with silver near the temples. Up close, he looked older than she first thought. Not old in years, old in the eyes, like someone who had spent too long carrying ghosts nobody else could see. Claire tried to steady her breathing. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias walked toward the stove without answering. He poured black coffee into a tin cup and placed it on the table near her before crouching beside a wooden chest near the fireplace. "Sit down," he said. Claire obeyed carefully, though every muscle in her body remained tense. Elias pulled clean cloth and whiskey from the chest before finally looking toward the blood soaking through her sleeve. "Let me see it." Claire instinctively pulled back. Elias noticed. His expression did not change. "If I meant you harm," he said quietly, "I would not have opened the door." The truth in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Slowly, she lowered her hand from the wound. Elias moved closer, kneeling beside the chair without touching her at first. Rain and lantern light flickered across his face while he examined the injury with calm eyes. "Bullet grazed you," he muttered. "Lucky." Claire swallowed hard. "I do not feel lucky." One corner of Elias's mouth almost moved. Almost. He poured whiskey over the cloth and pressed it gently against her shoulder. Claire winced, but did not cry out. Elias noticed that too. "You are not from around here," he said. Claire looked toward the dark window where distant shadows moved through rain beyond the fence line. "No. Then what are railroad men doing chasing you through Wyoming in the middle of the night?" Claire's eyes widened slightly. Elias tied the clean bandage around her arm with steady hands. "You recognize them," she whispered. Elias stood slowly and walked toward the window. "Recognize the horses first." Lightning flashed across the prairie, briefly illuminating the riders now nearing the property line. Claire felt cold spread through her stomach. "You know Kane Mercer?" Elias rested one hand against the rifle near the window, but did not pick it up yet. "Long time ago." Claire stared at him carefully. "Who are you?" Another silence filled the cabin. Long, heavy. Outside, hoofbeats crunched softly through wet dirt. Elias looked through the rain toward the approaching men, his gray eyes turning distant in the lantern glow. "Someone who should have stayed forgotten," he said quietly. Then 3 riders emerged through the storm beyond the fence, and Claire realized the men outside were not afraid of the dark prairie at all. They were afraid of the man standing beside the window. The riders stopped 20 yards from the cabin, their horses shifting nervously beneath the storm while rain slid from the brims of their hats in silver lines. Kane Mercer sat at the front of them like a man who had never hurried for anything in his life. Tall, broad across the shoulders, gray coat darkened by rainwater, his pale eyes fixed on the cabin windows without blinking once. Claire stood frozen beside the table as Elias remained near the rifle by the window, silent and still as weathered stone. The prairie outside seemed to hold its breath. Then Kane smiled slowly. "Been a long time, Blackwood." His voice carried through the storm like gravel dragged across wood. Elias did not answer immediately. Claire noticed something strange then. The men outside looked dangerous, but none of them reached for a weapon. Not yet. Men who feared nothing usually acted louder than that. These men were careful. Careful around Elias. "Thought you were dead," Kane called out again. Elias finally spoke without taking his eyes off the riders. "A lot of people hoped so." One of the younger riders shifted uneasily in his saddle. Claire caught the movement. The man looked barely 30, but his hands tightened against the reins every time Elias moved even slightly near the window. Kane glanced toward the cabin door. "We are not here for you." Elias rested one hand lightly against the rifle stock. "Then leave." Kane's smile faded. "The girl comes with us." Claire felt cold flood her stomach. She stepped backward instinctively, and the floorboard creaked beneath her boots. Every rider outside heard it. Kane's eyes narrowed toward the cabin. "Claire Whitlock," he said calmly. "Daughter of Judge Whitlock from Boston. You are a long way from home." Claire said nothing. Her pulse hammered so loudly she could barely hear the rain anymore. Kane continued softly. "You saw documents that did not belong to you. Railroad contracts. Land transfers. Names powerful enough to bury entire towns." Elias slowly looked back toward Claire then. For the first time since she arrived, his expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Understanding. Claire realized he already knew the kind of men chasing her before she ever spoke a word. You should not have run, Kane said. Men have disappeared for less. Elias turned his attention back toward the window. Funny thing about threats, he said quietly. They sound smaller in the rain. One of the riders cursed softly under his breath. Kane ignored him. This does not concern you anymore, Elias. The cabin fell silent after those words. Claire noticed it immediately. The way Kane said his first name. The way nobody moved afterward. Like everyone suddenly remembered something dangerous buried beneath the years. Elias stepped closer to the window slowly, lantern light catching the scar across his brow. The last time you said that, he murmured. 3 men nearly burned Black Creek to the ground. Thunder rolled across the prairie again. Claire looked between them carefully, piecing together fragments hidden beneath every word. These men were not strangers. They shared history. Bad history. Kane removed his gloves one finger at a time, eyes never leaving Elias. That was a long time ago. Not long enough. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof outside, while the horses stamped nervously against the mud. Claire realized then that the storm was not the reason the riders looked uneasy. It was the memory standing inside the cabin. Kane exhaled slowly. We do not want trouble. Elias glanced briefly toward Claire standing pale beside the table. Then you should not have followed her here. Another silence followed. Heavy, dangerous in ways Claire could not explain. Finally, Kane nodded once toward the cabin. You are protecting the wrong person. Elias looked toward Claire again. Her injured shoulder trembled slightly beneath the bandage. Rain-soaked hair clung to her face, while fear fought exhaustion in her green eyes. Something unreadable passed across his expression before he answered quietly. Maybe. Kane studied him carefully after that. Long enough for thunder to fade across the hills. Then his voice lowered. You know what happens if you stand between us and those railroad men. Elias reached for the lantern beside the window and turned the flame slightly lower until half his face disappeared into shadow. Yeah, he said softly. That is exactly what worries me. The storm lingered over the prairie for another hour before Kane Mercer finally pulled his horse backward through the mud. None of the riders took their eyes off the cabin while they turned toward the dark hills beyond the property line. Claire stood near the fireplace, holding her breath until the sound of hoofbeats slowly disappeared into the rain. Only then did she realize how tightly her hands were shaking. Elias remained beside the window long after the riders vanished from sight. The lantern beside him cast soft gold against the cabin walls while water dripped steadily from the edge of his coat onto the floorboards. He looked like a man listening for something deeper than thunder. Claire finally spoke carefully. They are not gone. Elias stared into the darkness outside. No, then why did they leave? He rested one hand against the wooden frame near the window. Because Kane remembers what happened the last time men cornered me inside a house. Claire swallowed quietly. She wanted to ask what happened. Wanted to understand why hardened men looked at Elias Blackwood the way townsfolk looked at approaching tornadoes. But something in his silence warned her not to push too hard. Elias finally turned away from the window and walked toward the stove. He poured fresh coffee into another tin cup before placing it near her without a word. Claire accepted it carefully. The warmth spread through her trembling hands, almost painfully. You should sleep, Elias said. Claire glanced toward the locked door. I do not think I can. Elias sat down across from her at the rough wooden table, his movements slow and tired beneath the lantern light. For the first time since she arrived, she noticed how exhausted he looked. Not physically, spiritually. Like every year of solitude had settled onto his shoulders one storm at a time. Outside, wind dragged across the prairie grass in long, hollow whispers. Claire lowered her eyes toward the steaming coffee. I was not supposed to find those documents, she admitted softly. Elias said nothing, but she could feel him listening. My father worked with railroad investors back east. Men with money large enough to buy judges, sheriffs, entire towns. Her voice tightened slightly. I thought they were discussing land agreements. Instead, I found records of families being forced off ranches after false debts appeared overnight. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes unreadable. Claire continued quietly. There were signatures, payments, names connected to Black Creek. Elias looked toward the fire for a long moment before speaking. Railroads do not build tracks, he said softly. They bury people under them. Claire studied him carefully. You already knew. A faint shadow crossed his expression. I used to help men like that. The words settled heavily inside the cabin. Rain tapped softly against the roof while the fire crackled low beside them. Claire stared at him in disbelief. Elias did not avoid her gaze. Years ago, Kane Mercer and I rode security for railroad companies moving west. Men called us whenever ranchers refused to sell land. Claire felt cold again despite the warmth of the fire. What changed? Elias looked down at his weathered hands resting against the table. Hands scarred by rope, leather, winters, and old regrets. One night, I realized every town we touched turned emptier afterward. His voice remained calm, but something inside it sounded worn thin with age. Families disappeared. Homes burned. Children stopped laughing. Claire noticed he never once tried defending himself. That unsettled her more than excuses would have. Silence stretched between them, while thunder rolled farther away beyond the mountains. Finally, Claire asked softly, "And your family?" Elias froze almost invisibly. It happened fast enough most people would have missed it, but Claire saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darkened for half a heartbeat. Elias stood slowly from the table and walked toward the fireplace. Above it hung an old silver pocket watch blackened slightly by smoke and age. He stared at it quietly before answering. "Dead." Claire immediately regretted asking. "I am sorry." Elias nodded once, but his eyes never left the watch. "So am I." The cabin fell silent again except for the storm fading outside. Claire wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, watching the firelight move across Elias's face while he stood alone near the hearth. There was something frightening about him. Every story she had heard about Western gunslingers suddenly felt real standing in that cabin. Yet beneath all that silence and danger, she saw something else too. Grief, deep enough to hollow a man out from the inside. Then Elias finally looked toward her again, and for the first time that night his voice sounded almost human when he said quietly, "You should not have come here, Claire Whitlock, because now they know where to find me again." Morning arrived slowly over the prairie, pale sunlight stretching across wet grass and muddy fence posts, while fog drifted low through the valley like smoke from an old memory. Claire woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke lingering through the cabin. For a few seconds she forgot where she was. Then she saw Elias sitting alone outside the porch railing, hat low over his eyes, sharpening a hunting knife against a whetstone while the wind moved quietly through the prairie grass around him. He had not slept. Claire could tell immediately. Some people carried exhaustion in their posture. Elias carried it in the silence around him. She pulled the blanket tighter over her shoulders and stepped carefully toward the door. The old floorboards creaked beneath her boots, but Elias did not look back. "Your shoulder?" he asked quietly. Claire touched the bandage beneath her sleeve. "Better." Elias nodded once and kept sharpening the blade with slow, steady movements. The sound scraped softly through the morning stillness. Claire stepped outside onto the porch, the cold air biting gently against her skin after the warmth of the cabin. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the hills, golden beneath the rising sun, beautiful in the lonely way only Western land could be. "I forgot places like this existed," she murmured. Elias finally glanced toward her. "Most people do." Claire leaned lightly against the porch post, watching him work. Up close in daylight, he looked even more worn than he had beside the fire. Lines carved deep near his eyes. Calloused hands marked by years of rope burns and winters. Yet there was something calm about him out here beneath the open sky. Like the prairie understood him better than people ever had. "Why did you stay?" Claire asked softly. Elias frowned slightly. "Here." She nodded toward the empty land surrounding them. "Most men would have left after everything you told me." Elias looked toward the distant hills before answering. "Out here, nobody asks questions." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "And if they do?" One corner of his mouth moved faintly. "They usually stop." For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Claire laughed quietly before she could stop herself. The sound surprised both of them. Elias froze for half a heartbeat, the whetstone stilling in his hand as he looked toward her. Claire noticed the change instantly. Not fear, not anger, something softer, something almost forgotten. Her laughter faded slowly beneath his stare. "What?" she asked carefully. Elias looked away toward the pasture. "Nothing." But Claire knew it was not nothing. Because for one brief moment, the cabin no longer felt haunted. Wind rolled gently across the prairie while Elias set the knife aside and stood from the porch step. He walked toward the barn without another word, broad shoulders disappearing into the morning fog. Claire watched him go, confused by the strange heaviness settling inside her chest. Then she noticed something hanging beside the porch doorway. A small faded ribbon tied carefully around an old iron nail. Pink once, now nearly colorless from years of weather. Claire reached toward it gently, just as Elias's voice came from behind her. "Do not touch that." She turned quickly. Elias stood near the barn entrance holding a saddle blanket in one hand. His face had gone still again. Closed. Claire lowered her hand immediately. "I am sorry. I did not know." Elias stared at the ribbon for a long moment before speaking quietly. "My daughter tied it there." The morning suddenly felt colder. Claire looked toward the faded ribbon moving softly in the wind. How old was she? Elias swallowed once before answering. 8. Claire did not ask what happened after that. She did not need to. The grief in his voice told her enough. Elias disappeared inside the barn again, while Claire remained on the porch staring at the ribbon. Somewhere beyond the hills, a crow called through the morning air. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast. Coming hard from the north ridge. Elias emerged from the barn immediately, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Claire turned toward the distant prairie just as a single rider burst through the fog at full speed. The horse looked exhausted, foam covering its neck and chest. The rider leaned low over the saddle, panic written across every movement. Elias stepped forward slowly, and the second he recognized the man approaching, something dangerous darkened across his face again. Because the rider racing toward the ranch was the sheriff of Black Creek. Sheriff Tom Avery nearly fell from his horse before the animal even stopped moving beside the porch. Sweat covered the horse despite the cold morning air, and mud splattered across the sheriff's coat all the way to his collar. He looked terrified. Not nervous. Terrified. Elias stepped off the porch slowly while Claire remained near the cabin doorway, watching the sheriff struggle to catch his breath. Tom Avery removed his hat with shaking hands, revealing thinning gray hair plastered to his forehead. "They are coming," he said hoarsely. Elias's face remained unreadable. "Who?" The sheriff glanced toward Claire briefly before lowering his voice. "Railroad men from Cheyenne. More than 20 riders by now. Kane Mercer reached them before sunrise." Claire felt her stomach tighten. Elias crossed his arms slowly. "That was fast." Tom swallowed hard. "They are saying the girl stole company records and murdered 2 guards trying to escape." Claire stepped forward immediately. "That is a lie." The sheriff looked uncomfortable meeting her eyes. "I know." Elias studied him carefully beneath the morning light. "Then why are you here?" Tom hesitated long enough for the wind to fill the silence between them. Somewhere near the barn, a loose chain knocked softly against wood. Finally, the sheriff spoke quietly. "Because they told the town if we do not hand her over, Black Creek loses railroad protection entirely." Claire frowned slightly. "Protection?" Tom laughed bitterly under his breath. "That is what rich men call ownership nowadays." Elias remained silent. Tom looked toward him carefully, almost cautiously. "You know what happens when the railroad cuts off supply routes? Food prices rise. Ranches disappear. Families leave." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "And you came here hoping I would make the decision easier for you." The sheriff lowered his eyes. "I came because they are afraid of you." Claire noticed the words affected Elias less than they affected the sheriff himself. Tom Avery looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with riding hard through the prairie. Like a man crushed slowly beneath choices he hated making. "Kane Mercer says if you hand her over peacefully," Tom continued carefully, "they will leave your ranch alone." Elias looked toward the distant hills beyond the pasture fence. Mercer always was generous with promises he could not keep. Tom stepped closer to the porch, lowering his voice even further. "Elias, these are not ordinary railroad men anymore. Investors from back east are involved now. Politicians too." Elias finally looked back at him. "And?" The sheriff hesitated. "And they still blame you for what happened 12 years ago." Claire saw the shift instantly. Tiny, nearly invisible. But the air around Elias seemed to grow colder after those words. "People blame storms for floods too," he said quietly. Tom rubbed one tired hand across his face. "You disappeared after that fire, Elias. Folks built stories to explain what they could not understand." Claire looked between them carefully. Fire. Again that word. Again that shadow passing briefly through Elias's eyes whenever the past came near him. Tom noticed Claire listening and sighed heavily. His wife and little girl died when the old ranch house burned down near Black Creek. Claire's breath caught softly. Elias turned away immediately, walking toward the fence line without a word. The sheriff watched him go with visible regret. He was different before that, Tom murmured quietly. Used to laugh. Used to help people. Claire looked toward Elias standing alone beside the pasture now, staring across miles of empty prairie beneath the pale morning sky. What happened after the fire? She asked softly. Tom's expression darkened. Some folks blamed railroad men. Others blamed Elias himself for leaving town too often back then. He lowered his voice further. Truth is, nobody really knows. Wind moved through the grass between them, while Claire watched Elias rest both hands against the wooden fence. So still, so distant, like a man standing beside his own grave. He never came back to town after that, Tom continued quietly. Not once. Claire realized then that the loneliness surrounding Elias was not accidental. It was punishment, self-inflicted and carefully maintained for years. Suddenly Elias spoke without turning around. You done talking about me like I am already dead? Tom cleared his throat awkwardly. They will reach Black Creek by tonight. Elias nodded once. Then you better ride back before they start asking questions. The sheriff hesitated before stepping closer again. Elias, if things go bad this time, there will not be enough dirt in Wyoming to bury what follows. Elias finally turned toward him, gray eyes calm beneath the morning sun. That stopped bothering me a long time ago. Then he looked toward Claire standing quietly beside the porch, and for one brief second the hardness in his face changed into something far more dangerous than anger. Concern. The sheriff rode away before noon, his horse disappearing slowly into the rolling prairie, while silence settled back over the ranch like dust after a long ride. Claire watched him vanish beyond the hills, then turned toward Elias standing near the fence line with both hands resting against the weathered wood. He had barely spoken since Tom Avery left. The wind moved through the grass around him, tugging lightly at the brim of his old brown hat, but he stood so still he looked carved into the land itself. Claire stepped carefully across the yard, boots crunching softly against dry dirt left behind after the storm. You think they will come tonight, she said quietly. Elias did not look at her. They will come sooner than that. Claire stopped beside the fence, following his gaze toward the empty horizon. Then I should leave. That finally made him turn, fast enough to surprise her. No, the word came sharper than either of them expected. Elias looked away almost immediately afterward, jaw tightening beneath the afternoon light. Claire studied him carefully. You barely know me. I know enough. His voice lowered again, calmer now. Men like Mercer do not chase people across 3 states over missing paperwork. Claire folded her arms against the cool wind. Those documents prove railroad companies forced families off their land by inventing debts and threats. If the newspapers back east published them, entire investors could lose fortunes. Elias nodded faintly, as if confirming something he already understood. Money scares rich men less than exposure does. Claire looked toward him again. You speak like someone who lived inside that world. A shadow crossed his expression. I did. Silence settled between them while clouds drifted slowly above the prairie. Somewhere near the barn, horses shifted lazily in the shade. Claire noticed how different the ranch felt during daylight. Less haunted, more human. She could almost picture the life that once existed there before grief hollowed everything out. Sheriff Avery said you used to laugh, she said softly. Elias gave the faintest breath of amusement through his nose. Tom talks too much. Was he wrong? Elias looked out across the pasture for so long Claire thought he would ignore the question entirely. Then he surprised her. My wife used to say the ranch sounded empty whenever I stopped laughing. Claire felt something tighten quietly inside her chest. Elias rarely spoke about the past, but whenever he did, every word carried weight like stones dropped into deep water. What was her name? She asked carefully. Elias lowered his eyes toward the fence rail beneath his hands. Anna. Even the way he said it sounded fragile, like speaking the name aloud still hurt after all these years. Claire waited a moment before asking gently, And your daughter? Elias swallowed once. Lucy. Wind swept across the prairie again, carrying the distant smell of cedar and dry earth. Claire imagined a little girl tying faded ribbons near the porch while a younger version of Elias laughed somewhere beside her. The image felt impossible compared to the man standing beside her now. You still love them, she whispered. Elias stared toward the horizon where sunlight stretched gold across endless land. That does not stop when people die. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. No, I suppose it does not. They stood together in silence after that, not uncomfortable anymore. Just quiet. The kind of silence shared by people carrying different versions of loneliness. Then Elias suddenly pushed away from the fence and walked toward the barn. Come on, he muttered. Claire frowned slightly before following him across the yard. Inside the barn, warm light filtered through wooden slats while dust floated lazily through the air. Elias moved toward an old chest near the tack wall and opened it carefully. Claire stepped closer, curiosity overtaking caution. Inside rested several leather gun belts, ammunition boxes, and 2 long rifles wrapped carefully in cloth. But beneath them sat something else. A small child's drawing folded neatly beside an old silver locket. Claire looked toward Elias. You kept all this time? Elias picked up the drawing gently between rough fingers. It showed a crooked little ranch house beneath an oversized yellow sun. 3 stick figures stood beside it holding hands. Lucy made this a week before the fire, he said quietly. Claire watched his face soften in a way she had not seen before. Brief, almost invisible, but real. Then Elias carefully returned the drawing to the chest and closed the lid. The softness disappeared as quickly as it came. He grabbed one of the rifles instead and handed it toward Claire. Her eyes widened slightly. I do not know how to use that. Elias looked toward the darkening sky outside the barn doors. You are going to learn before sunset. By late afternoon, the prairie had turned the color of old gold beneath the sinking sun, and Claire Whitlock stood 30 yards from the barn with a rifle trembling slightly in her hands while Elias watched her from beside the fence line. Wind rolled softly through the grass around them, carrying the distant scent of rain and cedar smoke. You are holding your breath, Elias said calmly. Claire frowned without lowering the rifle. I am trying not to miss. That is exactly why you will. She glanced toward him with irritation. You could try sounding encouraging. Elias rested one arm across the fence rail. You survived railroad men across 3 states. I figure encouragement is not something you need. Claire almost smiled despite herself. Almost. She lifted the rifle again toward the empty tin can balanced on a fence post nearly 40 feet away. Her shoulders still ached beneath the bandage every time she raised the weapon. Elias noticed immediately. He noticed everything. Lower your left arm a little, he said quietly, and stop fighting the recoil before it happens. Claire adjusted her grip carefully. The prairie fell silent except for wind brushing through dry grass. Then the shot rang out sharp across the valley. The tin can flipped backward off the post. Claire stared at it in surprise. Elias gave a faint nod. Better. Claire lowered the rifle slowly, a small laugh escaping her before she could stop it. Elias looked away almost immediately afterward, but not before she caught the briefest change in his face again. That strange softness that appeared only when he forgot to hide it. You really do remember how to smile, she murmured. Elias picked up another box of cartridges from the fence post beside him. Do not spread rumors. Claire shook her head lightly, and for one fleeting moment the ranch no longer felt hunted. Just quiet. Human. Warm in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Then hoofbeats echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the north ridge. Elias turned instantly toward the sound, every trace of softness vanishing from his face. Claire felt the change like cold air sweeping across open skin. More riders? She asked. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the distant hills. No. He listened another second. Just one horse. A lone rider appeared minutes later through the fading sunlight, moving slower than the sheriff had that morning. Older horse. Older man, too, by the look of him. Claire noticed Elias straighten slightly beside the fence as the rider approached the ranch. Something between caution and recognition darkened his expression. The old man finally stopped near the gate and removed his dusty hat carefully. Deep lines crossed his weathered face beneath silver hair and tired blue eyes. Elias, the man said quietly. Elias's jaw tightened. You should not be here, Walter. Claire looked between them curiously. The old man glanced toward her before returning his attention to Elias. Town is talking. Elias crossed his arms slowly. Town always talks. Walter dismounted carefully from the saddle, boots hitting dirt with the stiffness of age. This time feels different. Wind pushed through the ranch again, while sunset light stretched long shadows across the pasture. Claire stepped closer to the porch, but remained silent. She sensed this conversation mattered. Walter looked toward Elias with visible concern. Kane Mercer brought more men into Black Creek an hour ago. Railroad investors, too. Elias remained expressionless. I figured. They are offering money now. To ranchers. To deputies. To anyone willing to tell them where the girl is. Claire felt cold settle in her stomach. Walter noticed her reaction and softened slightly. Most decent folks refused. Elias gave a low, dry laugh beneath his breath. Black Creek ran out of decent folks years ago. Walter ignored the remark. Not everyone forgot who you used to be. That made Elias finally look at him directly. Maybe they should have. Silence settled heavily between them. Then Walter reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This arrived at the sheriff's office an hour ago. Elias took the paper carefully without unfolding it immediately. Claire watched his eyes darken slightly before he even read the contents. Like he already knew what waited inside. Finally, he opened the note beneath the fading sunlight. His face did not change while reading it, but something in the air around him suddenly felt dangerous again. Walter lowered his voice. Mercer says if the girl is not handed over by sunrise, they are burning the ranch down with both of you inside. Claire's breath caught softly. Elias folded the paper once and slipped it into his coat pocket without a word. Walter studied him carefully. Elias, do not do something foolish. The prairie wind moved gently through the grass, while sunset fire painted the horizon behind them. Then Elias looked toward Claire standing near the porch with fear written quietly across her face. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded calm enough to frighten everyone listening. Too late for that. Night settled over the prairie slow and heavy, wrapping the ranch in deep blue shadow while lantern light flickered softly through the cabin windows. Far beyond the hills, small points of fire moved across the darkness like restless stars. Riders. More than Claire could count. She stood near the porch railing with the rifle Elias had given her earlier, though her hands no longer trembled the way they had yesterday. Somewhere during the long hours beside him, fear had changed shape inside her. It still existed, but it no longer owned her completely. Elias sat quietly on the porch step, sharpening his hunting knife beneath the lantern glow, calm as winter stone. He had barely spoken since sunset. Claire looked toward the distant riders again. They are waiting until morning. Elias nodded once. Mercer likes audiences. Wind rolled through the prairie, carrying the smell of smoke from campfires beyond the ridge. Claire tightened her coat against the cold. You could still leave. Elias glanced up at her slowly. And let them follow you forever? This is not your fight. A faint shadow crossed his face then. Almost sadness. That stopped being true the second you knocked on my door. Silence settled between them while horses shifted softly inside the barn nearby. Claire looked toward Elias sitting beneath the lantern light, worn hands resting against the knife handle, gray eyes distant beneath the brim of his old hat. She realized then that he had already made peace with whatever happened next. That frightened her more than the riders waiting in the dark. I never thanked you properly, she whispered. Elias frowned slightly. For what? Claire looked toward the endless prairie stretching beneath moonlight. For seeing me as a person instead of a problem. Elias stared at her quietly for a long moment before lowering his eyes again. Funny thing about lonely people, he said softly. We notice each other. Claire felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. The wind moved through the porch again, tugging loose strands of chestnut hair across her face. Elias reached out before thinking and gently brushed them away from her eyes. The touch lasted barely a second. Rough fingertips against cold skin. But both of them froze afterward. Elias pulled his hand back slowly, like a man waking from a dream he never expected to have again. Claire looked at him differently after that. Not as a feared gunslinger. Not as a broken cowboy hiding from ghosts. Just a tired man who had spent too many years punishing himself for surviving. Then hoofbeats echoed faintly from beyond the pasture. Elias stood immediately, every trace of softness disappearing as he looked toward the darkness below the ridge. Lanterns moved closer now. Riders approaching the ranch. Claire stepped beside him on the porch, gripping the rifle tighter. What do we do? Elias looked toward the barn, then the house, then finally toward her. Moonlight caught the scar above his brow while prairie wind pushed softly against his coat. We stay standing. The riders stopped near the fence line just before dawn. More than 20 silhouettes sat on horseback beneath fading starlight, while Kane Mercer slowly guided his horse forward alone. No guns drawn. No shouting. Just silence heavy enough to feel. Elias stepped off the porch into the pale morning grass, while Claire remained near the doorway behind him. Kane removed his gloves carefully, eyes moving between them. Last chance, Blackwood. Elias said nothing. Kane sighed softly. Railroad men are offering enough money to buy half this territory. Hand over the girl and walk away. Elias looked back once toward Claire, standing quietly behind him. Her hair moved softly in the cold wind. Fear remained in her eyes, but so did trust. And something inside Elias shifted forever in that moment. Because after 10 years of emptiness, someone was looking at him like he was still worth believing in. He turned back, toward Kane Mercer slowly. No, the word landed across the prairie like thunder. Kane studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You really willing to lose everything over one woman? Elias glanced toward the ranch house behind him, toward the faded ribbon still tied beside the porch, toward the sunrise slowly washing gold across the endless prairie. Then he looked toward Claire one final time, and the hardness that had ruled his face for years finally faded into something quieter, something human. A long time ago, he said softly, I lost everything because I was too late. Wind rolled through the valley as dawn broke fully over the land. None of the riders moved. None of them spoke. And for the first time in years, Elias Blackwood no longer looked like a man haunted by the past. He looked like a man who finally remembered there were still things in this world worth protecting. Kane Mercer stared at him beneath the rising sun before slowly turning his horse away from the ranch. One by one, the other riders followed. No threats. No final words. Just silence and hoofbeats fading into morning light. Claire stood frozen beside the porch as the last rider disappeared beyond the hills. Why did they leave? She whispered. Elias looked out across the prairie glowing gold beneath the sunrise. Because men like Mercer understand one thing better than fear. Claire stepped closer beside him. What is that? Elias glanced down at her quietly, the first real smile touching his face in more than a decade. When a man has nothing left to lose, he becomes dangerous. But when he finally has something left to protect, he looked toward the sunrise stretching endless across Wyoming land. That is when even devils start riding away.